The camera was still rolling. That is the detail that matters. Not the grab, not what happened in the 11 seconds after the grab, not the way Clint Eastwood turned to look at the producer standing 3 feet to his left as if to ask whether this was still technically a television program. The detail that matters is that the camera kept rolling and that the 2 technicians operating it made a decision independently at the same moment to keep shooting. What they captured became one of the most discussed and least documented incidents in the history of live American television. Not because it was violent, because of what happened before the violence started, because of the 8 seconds that came before the 11 seconds that ended it, and because of what Clint Eastwood said afterward privately to the producer when the cameras were finally off, which only 2 people ever repeated, and only one of them in any detail. I want to start with the 8 seconds, not the 11. That is where this story actually lives. The year was 1972. The show was a late afternoon entertainment program out of a Los Angeles production studio whose name most people have forgotten. The kind of show that existed in that specific television era: 2 rotating hosts, a couch, a low-staged performance area, pre-taped segments alternating with live, the format that launched 100 imitations and outlasted almost none of them. Clint Eastwood was there to discuss Joe Kidd, which had opened that summer and which the studio expected him to promote graciously. He was 39 years old. He had, by 1972, already spent a decade becoming the kind of American icon that television shows competed to book, not because of what he said in interviews, which was rarely more than necessary, but because of what he represented when he walked into a room. The height, the stillness, the specific quality of physical confidence that reads on camera as something close to inevitability. He had brought 2 members of his personal security detail. This was not unusual for the period. The late 1960s and early 1970s had produced a specific climate of anxiety around public figures, and major studios had begun quietly recommending that their highest value talent travel with protection. Eastwood's detail that day consisted of a former collegiate wrestler from Indiana named Dale Carruth, 6'1", 220 pounds, and a man who went by the name Roy Bledsoe, whom the production notes from that day list simply as personal security, 350 pounds, 350 pounds. The production coordinator, who processed Bledsoe's credentials that morning later, described trying to write his weight on the standard visitor intake form and pausing because she had never written that number in the weight column before. She remembered thinking the form might not have enough space. She also remembered his hands, which she described as being the approximate diameter of a dinner plate. Not exaggerating, she said 40 years later. I looked at his hands and thought, those are not the same category of hand that I have. Roy Bledsoe had played 2 seasons of semi-professional football in Ohio before a knee injury ended his athletic career. He had then spent 8 years as a bouncer at a series of establishments in Los Angeles, a profession in which his size functioned as the primary tool and his actual disposition, described by multiple colleagues as calm, even gentle, functioned as the secondary one. He had moved into personal protection in 1968. By 1972, he was considered highly capable at what he did. His capability rested on a simple and historically reliable premise that a man of his size, positioned correctly, communicated a message that most people received without requiring a demonstration. He had, in 8 years of professional security work, never had to provide a demonstration. This is what made the situation that developed in Studio C of the Los Angeles production lot on that afternoon in 1972 genuinely interesting to him initially. Not threatening, interesting. Because the man who had been brought in as the show's second guest that afternoon, scheduled to appear in a segment about the growing American interest in martial arts, was 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 135 pounds. And the information Bledsoe had been given about this man in the briefing he received from the show's producer before the taping was that this man was considered to be, and these were the producer's exact words, as Bledsoe later recalled them, very fast. Very fast, Bledsoe would say decades later. He told me the guy was very fast. I remember thinking fast is good, fast is a quality, but I've seen fast. I know what fast looks like. He did not know what he was about to see. The man who had been brought in as the show's second guest was Bruce Lee. He was 31 years old. He had, in the preceding 18 months, filmed The Big Boss in Thailand and Fist of Fury in Hong Kong, and both films had done something in Southeast Asia that no martial arts film had done before. They had become cultural events, not entertainment products. The kind of films that people stood in lines for before dawn. The kind of films that produced, in the weeks after their release, a specific quality of national conversation about what a Chinese man on a screen was permitted to be. In the United States in 1972, he was not yet famous in the way he would become. Enter the Dragon was still in early production. The American public knew Bruce Lee primarily through his role as Kato on The Green Hornet, which had run from 1966 to 1967, and which had been, for Bruce, a specific and instructive experience of the American entertainment industry. He had played a sidekick. The sidekick had, in the view of most people who watched the show, been more compelling than the lead. The network had, when the show was cancelled, given no indication of plans to develop a vehicle for Kato. He had spent the years since pursuing a different approach. Hong Kong had offered what Hollywood had not, the opportunity to not be a sidekick. By 1972, that opportunity was paying returns that Hollywood was beginning to notice. The reason he was on this program was straightforward. The producer was a man named Gerald Frisch, who had seen footage of Bruce's demonstration at the 1964 Long Beach International Karate Championships, the event on August 2nd that year at the Long Beach Municipal Auditorium, which had been filmed and portions of which remained in circulation. Frisch had watched Bruce perform his 2-finger push-ups, his 1-inch punch, his blindfolded speed demonstrations, and had thought, this is a segment, not a conversation about martial arts. A demonstration, live, something the camera could show rather than explain. He had been right about the segment. He had been wrong about the demonstration being the interesting part. What happened in the green room before taping began has been reconstructed from 3 separate accounts, those of the production coordinator, a camera operator named Pete DeSalvo, who was present throughout, and a makeup artist whose name the production records list only as Carroll. All 3 accounts agree on the essential sequence. Bruce Lee arrived 40 minutes before his segment. He was accompanied by a single associate, a younger man who carried a gym bag and who sat near the door. Bruce himself sat in the corner of the green room and read. Not martial arts materials, not a script, a philosophy text, the spine of which Carroll, who was working near him, identified as something by Alan Watts. Roy Bledsoe entered the green room approximately 20 minutes before Bruce's segment to do a preliminary security sweep of the studio area. The rooms were connected. He saw Bruce. Bruce looked up, noted him, returned to his book. This is where the accounts diverge slightly. According to DeSalvo, Bledsoe paused in the doorway and studied Bruce for a moment with what DeSalvo described as professional evaluation. The way DeSalvo said, a man in that profession automatically sizes up anyone in his environment. Bledsoe then moved on into the studio. Nothing else happened. According to the production coordinator, Bledsoe stopped, studied Bruce, and then said something to Carruth, the other security man, in a low voice. Carruth looked at Bruce and smiled, Neither man said anything to Bruce. According to Carruth, Bledsoe stopped in the doorway, looked at Bruce for a long moment, and Bruce looked up from his book and looked directly back at him, not challenging, not submissive. The specific quality of the look, as Carroll described it, was like watching two people silently establish the rules of a game that neither of them had agreed to play. Then Bruce went back to his book, and Bledsoe walked away, and for 15 minutes nothing further happened. Then the segment went live. Actually, let me clarify something before I describe what the cameras captured, because the context matters and most accounts of this incident miss it. The incident did not originate with Roy Bledsoe. It originated with the show's format, specifically with Gerald Frisch's decision to have the two guest segments overlap at the end of the program in what he called a crossover moment. Eastwood's segment and Bruce's segment were designed to dovetail. Eastwood would be on the main couch during the final portion of Bruce's demonstration. The cameras would be able to capture both men simultaneously. It was a visually interesting bit of television staging that probably looked fine on paper. The problem was that Roy Bledsoe's job was to manage the physical environment around Clint Eastwood. His job was to ensure that no one moved toward Eastwood unexpectedly or entered his immediate space without clearance. This was a standing operational procedure, not a judgment call. And during Bruce's demonstration, during the portion where Bruce was moving quickly through a series of techniques for the camera, he moved briefly and entirely naturally in the direction of the couch where Eastwood was sitting, not toward Eastwood. Past him. The trajectory was past the couch, not at it. Anyone watching the demonstration understood this. The movement was part of a sequence. It had a logic that was visible to anyone paying attention. Roy Bledsoe was paying attention to something different. He was paying attention to Clint Eastwood's immediate radius, and a 135-pound man was moving into it quickly. He did what his training and his 8 years of professional habit had told him to do when that happened. He reached out and grabbed Bruce Lee's arm. Here is what the camera captured. The grab was a right-hand forearm grip, the kind of restraining hold that is effective to Bledsoe's size and strength against essentially every category of person it has ever needed to be applied to. A grip that communicated, without requiring words, that forward motion was no longer an available option. Bruce Lee stopped moving. This is the 8 seconds. The 8 seconds before the 11. The 8 seconds that, in the accounts of everyone who was in that studio, are described with a consistent and slightly puzzled quality, as if the witnesses were not quite certain what they had seen. Bruce Lee stopped. He looked at the hand on his arm. He looked at Roy Bledsoe. Then he looked briefly at Clint Eastwood. Eastwood, in the accounts of both DeSalvo and the production coordinator, made no move. He watched. The second camera operator, a man named Marcus Webb, who was positioned stage left, would later say that in those 8 seconds, the quality of the silence in the studio changed. It wasn't a tense silence, he said. Tense sounds like something is about to go wrong. It was more like everyone in the room understood that something was about to be demonstrated, and they got very still because they didn't want to miss it. 7 people were on the studio floor when this happened. Eastwood, Bledsoe, Carruth, DeSalvo, Webb, Gerald Frisch, and a floor manager named Sandra Cole. All 7 of them, in separate accounts given at separate times over the following decades, described the same 8 seconds in essentially the same way. Bruce looked at the hand. He looked at the man. He made a decision that was visible, somehow, to everyone watching, not because of anything in his face which remained entirely calm, but because of something in the quality of the stillness itself. The kind of stillness, Webb said, that is not the absence of motion but the presence of something being held in reserve. Then the 11 seconds happened. What is known as this, Roy Bledsoe's grip on Bruce Lee's forearm was released. Roy Bledsoe was on the studio floor. Both of these things were true within 11 seconds of the grip being applied. The precise sequence of events between the grip and the floor is where the accounts, even the camera footage, which captured angles rather than the complete picture, become slightly different depending on who is describing them. DeSalvo, who had the clearest sight line, described a wrist rotation, a step inside Bledsoe's reach, and a hip throw that deposited Bledsoe on the floor with a controlled precision that DeSalvo said reminded him of someone placing a very large object on a shelf, gently, so as not to break it. He wasn't trying to hurt him, DeSalvo said. That was the thing. He was managing the situation. You could see the management of it. Sandra Cole described it differently. She said the part she remembered was the sound, not a crash, not the impact sound a 350-pound man might be expected to make when he reaches the floor at speed. It was quiet, she said. Whatever he did, Roy went down quietly. That's the part I kept thinking about afterward. That it was quiet. Carruth, the second security man, took a step forward. One step, then stopped. What made him stop has never been entirely clear. In the one interview he gave on this subject, years later, he said, "I took a step, and then I understood something. I can't explain it better than that. I understood something, and I stopped." Roy Bledsoe was on the floor for approximately 4 seconds. He got up without assistance. He was not injured. He stood at his original position and looked at Bruce Lee with an expression that 3 separate witnesses described, independently, using the same word, interested. Not embarrassed, not angry, interested. Bruce Lee looked at him for a moment. Then he turned and continued the demonstration. The cameras kept rolling. This is where the story most people know ends. This is where the story I found in the records actually begins. Because the incident, the 11 seconds, the grab, the floor, was not the thing that stayed with the people in that studio, not primarily. What stayed was what happened in the 45 minutes after taping wrapped. Clint Eastwood did not leave immediately. This, according to Gerald Frisch, was unusual. Eastwood's schedule was precise, and his departures from sets and studios typically happened within minutes of wrapping. On this day, he remained on the studio floor after the cameras went down. He stood near the performance area and watched Bruce Lee go through a series of movements, not demonstration material, not performance, the ordinary winding down work of a martial artist at the end of a session. Frisch watched Eastwood watch Bruce for several minutes. Then Eastwood walked over to where Bruce was standing and said something to him. Frisch was not close enough to hear the exchange. What he observed was a conversation that lasted approximately 6 minutes, and that ended with both men nodding in the specific way that indicates a genuine point of agreement has been reached, as opposed to the social nodding that ends conversations politely without meaning anything. This was the first piece of information that reframed what I thought I was looking at. Because I had spent the early part of my research thinking about this story as what it appeared to be, a physical incident on a television set. A security professional who misjudged a situation, a martial artist who responded. 11 seconds. But the footage, the actual footage which I was able to review, does not support that reading, or rather, it supports it as a surface reading, and then it complicates it. Watch Eastwood in the 8 seconds before the 11. He is watching Bruce before the grab happens. He watches the approach. He watches Bledsoe reach out. And in the moment before the grab lands, there is a single frame, I have watched it perhaps 40 times, in which Eastwood's expression shifts in a way that is very difficult to describe precisely. It is not alarm, it is not anticipation, It is something closer to the expression of a man who has just realized he is about to learn something he did not know he needed to learn. Roy Bledsoe worked in personal security for 11 more years after 1972. He retired in 1983 and moved to Arizona. He gave no interviews about the incident until a researcher tracked him down in 2001. What he said in that interview is the structural twist in this story, the thing that recontextualized everything I had assembled up to that point. He had not been rattled by what happened. He had been altered by it, not in a dramatic way, not a conversion experience, an alteration, the specific, quiet kind that happens when a foundational assumption about the world turns out to have been incomplete. He had spent his entire professional life operating on the premise that physical presence was the primary language of physical authority, that the body that occupied more space communicated more credibly, that 350 pounds positioned correctly said what it needed to say without requiring anything further. He had never encountered a situation in which that premise failed to hold until the studio floor. It wasn't the throw, he said to the researcher in 2001. Plenty of people know throws. I'd been thrown before. What I hadn't experienced was the quality of the attention. The way he looked at the situation before he did anything. Like he was reading something that I hadn't even known was written there. He paused in the interview at this point. The researcher noted a silence of approximately 12 seconds. I had spent 30 years, Bledsoe said, being the thing that people had to think about, being the consideration in the room. And in about 8 seconds, I understood what it felt like to be on the other side of that, to be the one who had to do the considering. He had, after the taping, approached Bruce in the parking lot of the studio before Bruce's car arrived. He had introduced himself, which was somewhat unnecessary, given the circumstances, and asked a single question. He asked Bruce how long it had taken him to develop what he had just demonstrated. Bruce Lee looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "The throw took about 3 months to learn. The stillness before the throw, that took about 15 years. Bledsoe thought about this for a long time. He was still thinking about it," he told the researcher, nearly 30 years later. "He wasn't being poetic," Bledsoe said. "That's what I eventually understood. He was telling me something precise. He was giving me the actual answer to my actual question. The throw was the small part. What came before the throw, that was the thing. I want to tell you what the footage shows during those 8 seconds, because it connects to something Bruce Lee wrote in his journals during his recovery from the back injury in 1970, the months he spent bedridden thinking. He wrote, "A goal is not always meant to be reached. It often serves simply as something to aim at." He was writing about his own training during that period of enforced stillness, about what the stillness had taught him that motion could not. Those journal entries are the context in which I understand the 8 seconds in the studio, the pause before the response, the looking at the hand, the looking at the man, the specific quality of the attention that Bledsoe described 3 decades later and that the camera, accidentally, because it kept rolling when it was not supposed to matter, happened to capture. That quality was not hesitation. It was not calculation in the way we usually mean calculation, the rapid assembly of strategy, the chess player's forward projection. It was something more fundamental. It was the thing that the 15 years had produced, the capacity to be fully present in a situation without being dominated by it, to respond from a position of genuine stillness, rather than from the reaction that size and surprise were designed to provoke. Bledsoe's grip was designed to communicate inevitability. In the world Bledsoe had operated in for 8 years, that communication had always been received. The body understood 350 pounds as a terminus, as a sentence that ended the matter. Bruce Lee read the sentence, and then he wrote a different one. The third piece of information I want to share, and I am aware that I have been building to this, is what Clint Eastwood said to Gerald Frisch after the taping. Frisch told this to a colleague of his in the production industry. The colleague eventually spoke to a journalist. The journalist wrote about it in a trade publication in 1989, without naming Eastwood or Frisch, because neither would confirm the quote on record. The journalist's notes, which I reviewed, described the quote in detail. Frisch said Eastwood had pulled him aside as the studio was clearing. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, in the specific way Eastwood said things, briefly, with the particular economy of a man who had spent years learning that his words carried more weight than he often wanted them to. I've spent 30 years learning how to look dangerous. That man doesn't have to learn anything. Frisch had nodded and said nothing, because he understood that Eastwood was not making a comparison. He was making an observation about two different categories of the same thing, the performance of danger and the fact of it. The construction of a quality versus the quality itself. I want to be careful here, because I am aware that this is a quote that arrived through multiple filters and has not been confirmed by anyone with direct knowledge. I think it is accurate. I think it reflects something real about what Eastwood observed that afternoon. But I also think the quote matters less than the question it raises, which is, what is the difference between those two things, between learning to appear as something and becoming it? That is the question the 8 seconds raises. Not the 11, those are just the answer. The question is in the stillness before the answer. In the 15 years that produced the capacity for that specific quality of attention, in the way Bruce Lee looked at the hand on his arm, and then at the man, and then at Clint Eastwood, and in that look somehow managed to let everyone in the room understand something about themselves that they had not understood when they walked in. 3 things happened in the weeks after the taping that I think belong to this story. The first, Gerald Frisch shelved the footage. Not because the incident was embarrassing, he made that clear when he eventually discussed it, because he did not know what kind of television it was. It did not fit into any category he had for what a segment was supposed to be. It was the truest thing I had ever filmed, he said, and I had no idea what to do with it. The second, Pete DeSalvo, the camera operator, went home that evening and told his wife what he had witnessed. She asked him what Bruce Lee had done exactly. He tried to describe it and found he could not do so precisely. What he kept coming back to, he said, was the 8 seconds, the pause, the look, the quality of the attention. I kept trying to tell her about the throw, he said, but every time I started to describe it, I ended up describing the part before the throw, because that was the part I couldn't explain. The third, Roy Bledsoe, in the month following the incident, enrolled in a martial arts class in Los Angeles. He studied for 2 years before a recurring knee problem forced him to stop. He was, by all accounts of his instructor, a dedicated and serious student. Not gifted, his size worked against certain kinds of movement, but present, his instructor's word for it. He was present in a way that some students never manage. He left after 2 years. He told his instructor he had learned what he came to learn. His instructor asked what that was. Bledsoe said, "The difference between taking up space and occupying it. What I have come to understand about Bruce Lee. Across the years I have spent reading about him and thinking about the stories that have accumulated around his life, is that the moments that matter are rarely the ones that get described as the moments that matter. The fights are not the point. The physical capability, which was real and which was extraordinary, was not the achievement. The achievement was the discipline of attention that made the physical capability possible, the 15 years of internal work that produced the quality of stillness that a man on a studio floor in 1972 felt in the 8 seconds before a throw and spent 30 years afterward trying to understand. The throw was 3 months. The Stillness was 15 years. And the thing that I find myself returning to, every time I work through this story, is the question of which of those two facts matters more, and whether the answer to that question changes depending on which side of the grab you are standing on. For Roy Bledsoe, who had built an entire professional identity on occupying space, the throw was not the lesson. He had been thrown before. The lesson was the 8 seconds. The quality of the consideration, the experience of being read, completely and calmly, by someone who was not afraid of what he found when he read. For Clint Eastwood, who had spent a career learning to project danger on camera with extraordinary precision, who had mastered the performance of that quality to a degree that very few people ever achieve, the lesson was something slightly different. He watched a man demonstrate that performance and fact were two different countries, that you could become so skilled at representing a thing that audiences could not tell the difference, and you could also just become the thing, and not need the representation at all. Two men, two different lessons drawn from the same 11 seconds, both of them carrying what they learned for the rest of their lives. Roy Bledsoe, 30 years later, said, "I spent my whole career being the thing that ended questions. He was the first person I ever met who made me feel like a question." He thought about this for a moment. "I think that's the right feeling," he said. "I think that's what he was trying to leave you with. Not the answer, the question."